Severin Lazari married a stranger because his dying mother asked him to. He told himself it meant nothing, a last kindness for a woman with 3 weeks left, a signature he would quietly undo once the funeral flowers had wilted. He did not know his mother had chosen the bride on purpose. He did not know the silent woman at the end of the aisle carried a secret that would burn the Lazari name to its foundation. And he never expected that the thing to undo him would not be her face. It would be that she refused, completely, to be afraid of him. There were two kinds of silence in Severin Lazari's world, and he had learned, by the age of 9, to tell them apart. There was the silence of a room before he entered it, the clipped, breathless hush of men who knew his name and the things attached to it. And there was the silence of a room after, the kind that pooled in the corners once he had said the only sentence that needed saying. He had built an entire empire inside that second silence, distribution lines that ran the length of the eastern seaboard, 3 shipping ports that belonged to him in every way that mattered, and none that a court could prove. A surname that made customs officers misplace paperwork and made rival families redraw their maps. At 34, Severin owned the kind of life that other men only whispered about, and he wore it the way he wore his charcoal suits. Tailored close, buttoned to the throat, and entirely without warmth. He did not drink to excess. He did not gamble. He did not keep a woman in a downtown apartment the way his cousin Renato did, like a watch he wound only when bored. Severin kept ledgers and routines and a loaded weapon in the drawer of a desk that had belonged to his grandfather, and he kept his heart somewhere so far down that most people assumed, reasonably, that he simply didn't have one. Renato found this funny. Renato found most of Severin's discipline funny, in the easy, smiling way of a man who had never once had to be the one to make the hard call, and who resented, quietly, that the calls were never his to make. The only person who had ever argued otherwise was now dying in the east wing of his estate. Ottavia Lazari had been a force once, a woman who could quiet a table of armed men with a single raised eyebrow, who had run the family's books for 2 decades, and buried 2 husbands without weeping where anyone could see. Now she weighed almost nothing. The cancer had hollowed her out the way the tide hollows a shell, patiently, completely, until what remained was beautiful and brittle and ringing with emptiness. She lay in a hospital bed that looked obscene against the antique furniture, surrounded by the white orchids she insisted on having changed every morning, because she said the dying should be allowed at least one luxury that asked nothing of them in return. Severin visited her at 6 every evening. It was not sentiment. It was schedule. He sat in the same leather chair, reported the same sanitized version of the day's business, and watched his mother's chest rise and fall beneath a blanket she no longer had the strength to pull up herself. "You look tired," Ottavia said one evening, her voice a thread. "You look like your father at the end. All edges and no rest." "I'm fine, Mama." "You're not fine. You're alone. There's a difference. And you've stopped being able to feel it." Her dark eyes, the only part of her the illness hadn't dimmed, fixed on him with the old, unsettling clarity. "I have a request, the last one I will ever make of you. And you are going to say yes before you understand it, because that is what a good son does for a dying mother." Severin almost smiled. "That's manipulation." "It's mothering. Same tools, better intentions." She drew a slow breath that cost her something. "There is a woman. Her name is Imara. I want you to marry her, before the month is out, before I go." The clock on the mantel ticked 4 times before he answered. "You've never mentioned her." "No," his mother agreed, and something flickered across her ruined face. Not quite guilt, not quite triumph. "I haven't." Her cold hand found his wrist and held it with surprising strength. "Promise me, Severin. Marry her. Whatever you discover afterward, and you will discover things, Remember that I knew exactly what I was doing." He should have asked what that meant. Later, he would lie awake hating himself for not asking. Instead, he said, "Yes, Mama," because she was dying, and it cost him nothing. He believed that. It would be the last simple thing he believed for a long time. The contract arrived before the woman did. That was how Severin understood the world. Paper first, people second. So when his lawyer slid a single sealed folder across the desk in his study, he opened it expecting the usual architecture of a transaction. A prenuptial agreement, a confidentiality clause, a schedule of assets walled off from each other like rival territories. Instead, he found 3 pages in his mother's own handwriting, shaky but deliberate, and a photograph clipped to the corner. The woman in the photograph was not smiling. That was the first thing he noticed, because women smiled in photographs the way they smiled at him, as defense, as currency, as a door held politely shut. This woman simply looked back at the camera as though she had taken its measure and found it ordinary. Deep brown skin, dark eyes set wide and steady, her hair pulled away from a face that was striking precisely because it refused to perform. Beneath the photo, in his mother's hand, Imara Hale. "Be patient with her. She has paid more than you know." He did not understand the line. He filed it away, the way he filed away everything he didn't yet have a use for. They met for the first time 3 days before the wedding, in the cold, formal sitting room that the family used for negotiations rather than guests. Severin arrived first, as he always did, and watched from the window as a modest car he didn't recognize came up the long drive. No bodyguard, no lawyer of her own. A woman in a plain, dark coat who climbed the marble steps the way other people approached a job interview they fully expected to fail and had decided not to mind. Anselm showed her in. She stopped just inside the door, took in the room, the cold hearth, the men's portraits, Severin himself standing rigid by the window, and did not flinch. "You're him," she said. Not a question. "I'm him." He gestured to a chair. She didn't take it. "I want to be clear about what this is," Imara said, and her voice was low and even, the voice of someone who had learned to keep it that way under pressure. "Your mother asked me. I said yes. I'm not here for your money, and I'm not here to pretend it's something we both know isn't real. I'll wear the ring. I'll stand where I'm told to stand. When she's gone, you'll never have to see me again." A small pause. That's the whole of it. It was, almost word for word, the speech he had prepared to give her. Hearing it in another mouth, calm, unafraid, faintly bored, did something strange to the back of his neck. "Why did you say yes?" he asked. For the first time, something moved behind her eyes. A shutter, sliding closed. "Because she asked me," Imara said. "Same as you." It was a lie. He had spent his whole life listening for the precise texture of a lie, and that one had weight to it, a hidden room behind a thin wall. But before he could press, a nurse appeared in the doorway and said his mother was asking for them both, together now. And Imara turned toward that voice with a tenderness so immediate, so unguarded, that Severin forgot the question entirely. She knew the way to his mother's room. She did not have to be shown. He noticed it the way you notice a single wrong note in a song you've heard 1,000 times. She knew the way. A stranger his mother had supposedly chosen at random, walking the corridors of his house as though she had walked them before. He said nothing. He followed her up the stairs, and he watched the back of this woman he was about to marry, and something Severin hadn't felt in years stirred in him, the cold, electric thrill of not knowing something. He would marry her in 3 days. He had no idea he had just met the most dangerous person who would ever love him. A wedding 3 doors down from a deathbed is not a celebration. It is a transaction the family agrees to call something gentler. They held it in the estate's private chapel, a narrow stone room that smelled of cold wax and older money, so that Octavia could be wheeled in to watch. There were 11 guests. There should have been 300, and the smallness of it sat in the room like a held breath. Severin stood at the altar in a black suit and felt nothing he could name. Only the familiar machinery of a thing being done correctly, on schedule, with the right papers signed. Then the doors opened and Imara walked in alone, because there was no one to give her away, and she did not seem to need anyone to. She wore a simple ivory dress that someone, his mother, he would later realize, had chosen with care. No veil. Her head was high, her hands empty, and she crossed the long stone floor with the unhurried steadiness of a woman walking toward a thing she had already decided to survive. She did not look at the guests. She looked at Octavia, and his mother, who had not smiled in weeks, who could barely lift her own hand from the blanket, smiled at Imara the way you smile at someone you have been waiting a very long time to see again. Severin felt the wrongness of it before he could explain it. You smile like that at family, not at strangers your dying mother picked. The vows were brief. He slid the ring on. Her finger was cold. His mother wept without sound. When the officiant pronounced it done, Imara did not turn to Severin. She crossed to the wheelchair, knelt, and took both of Octavia's frail hands in hers, and the two women bent their foreheads together and stayed like that, close, whispering, private. For the length of 3 heartbeats too long, he heard only one fragment of it, in his mother's papery voice. You forgave me. That was more than I had any right to ask. Forgave her. For what? The officiant cleared his throat, and the moment folded itself away, and the machinery of the ceremony resumed. But Severin had spent 34 years in rooms where the truth was the one thing no one said aloud, and he had just watched 2 women say a great deal to each other without words. He filed it away beside the rest. The key, the way she knew the corridors, the smile his dying mother had been saving. He had a drawer in his mind for unfinished business, and it was beginning to fill. Afterward, in the antechamber where the family gathered with thin glasses of champagne nobody wanted, Renato came forward first. His cousin was all warmth, all white teeth, gripping Severin's shoulder and calling it a beautiful thing, a good omen. Aunt Octavia always did know best. Then he turned to the bride and took her hand to kiss it. Severin was watching. He almost always was. So he saw the thing no one else saw. The precise instant Renato's fingers closed around Imara's, her steady hand, the hand that had not trembled walking down an aisle in a house full of armed strangers, gave one small, violent flinch. A flinch she crushed in the same breath, smoothing her face back into stillness so fast that a less careful man would have called it nothing. But Severin built his life on the things other men called nothing. She wasn't afraid of him. She had made that clear in the cold sitting room 3 days ago, looking at the most dangerous man in the city as though he were weather. She had married into a family of killers without flinching once. She had flinched for Renato. Later, as the small party thinned and the champagne went flat in its glasses, he found her standing alone before the memorial wall at the back of the chapel, the framed photographs of the Lazari dead, generations of hard men in hard collars, the founders of everything he now owned and everything he now was. She was looking at none of them. She was looking past them, at nothing, her jaw set, her eyes bright and dry with something that was not grief and was not fear, but lived in the same cold country as both. Her hand had risen halfway to the frames and stopped, as if touching them might cost her something she had decided long ago not to spend. When she sensed him, she composed herself instantly. "Your mother is tired," she said. "She should rest." "You knew the way to her room," Severin said quietly. "The first day. No one showed you." For a moment something flickered. The shutter again, sliding closed over a lit room. Lucky guess. Imara said. It was the second lie he had caught her in, and she told it as smoothly as the first. He let her walk away. He let her go because she had made him curious, and nothing had managed that in years, and because in his closed fist, his mother had pressed, during that long whispered embrace, a small worn key into Imara's palm, and Imara had closed her hand around it like a woman taking hold of a blade. He had seen that too. Severin Lazari did not confront a mystery. He surrounded it. So he did not ask his wife who she was. He had her watched, the way he would have watched a rival, a courier, a leak, quietly, from a distance, by men who reported only to him. For 9 days she gave them nothing. She moved through the estate like a guest in a museum, courteous and remote, spending her afternoons at Atavia's bedside reading aloud in a low voice while his mother drifted. At night, she returned to the room they did not share and closed the door. On the 10th night, she climbed out a side door at 11:30 in plain clothes and drove herself into the city in a car that wasn't hers. It was an old sedan, the kind that disappears in traffic, parked 2 streets from the estate where the cameras didn't reach. She'd known it was there. She'd known the angle of every lens on his property, which meant she had studied them. Which meant the courteous, remote houseguest reading to his dying mother had also been, the entire time, casing his home with the patience of a professional. The realization should have alarmed him. Instead, it sharpened the strange thing that had been growing in him since the wedding, the thing he had no filing drawer for. Severin followed alone. He told himself it was diligence. It was not diligence. She drove to the far east end, past the good streets and the bad ones, to a low brick building with a buzzing sign that read, St. Bernadette, Residential Care. He parked across the street and killed the engine and watched her go in with the ease of long habit, nodding to a night nurse who clearly knew her name. A third-floor window lit briefly, then a curtain. He sat in the dark for 40 minutes, and when she did not come out, he did a thing he could not afterward fully justify. He went in. The night nurse, seeing his face and the cut of his coat, decided some questions were safer unasked, and told him room 311. He went up. The door was ajar. He did not go in. He stood in the corridor in the wash of fluorescent light and looked through the gap, and what he saw rearranged something in his chest that he had assumed was load-bearing and permanent. His wife was sitting on the edge of a narrow bed, and she was laughing. Not the contained, courteous expression she rationed out at the estate. A real laugh, head tipped, shoulders loose, a sound bright and helpless and young. On the bed was a girl of 15 or 16, thin, with a soft halo of natural hair and a hospital bracelet on her wrist, and the unmistakable pallor of someone the body has been failing for a long time. The girl was laughing too, and signing something rapid with her hands. The sisters had spoken half in sign since Senna lost most of her hearing as a child, and Imara signed back, fluent, teasing, alive. A heart monitor ticked steadily beside them. There were get-well cards taped to the wall, and a photograph on the nightstand of a man with kind eyes and Imara's exact jaw. Severin stood very still and understood, all at once, several things he had been wrong about. She had not married him for his money, or rather, she had, but not for herself. He thought of the modest car, the bare ring finger, the room she kept like a hotel. Every cent of whatever he was worth to her was already spoken for, poured into a buzzing brick building on the wrong side of the city, into a girl with a failing heart and a steady monitor. The cold woman who had faced him down in his own house without once blinking was, behind a curtain at midnight, the warmest person he had ever watched breathe. He should have left then. He didn't. He heard the girl's voice, light, slurred a little with exhaustion, say, "Is it almost over? You promised it's almost over." And he heard his wife answer, low and fierce and certain, "It's almost over, Senna. I just have to finish what I started." Then we never have to be afraid of any of them again. Any of them. Not it. Not this. Them. The word landed in Severin like a hook. Them was a family. Them was a name. And the way she said finish what I started did not belong to a woman who had stumbled into the Lazaries by his mother's whim. It belonged to a woman who had come for something. He was turning to go, finally, when the night nurse rounded the corner with a clipboard and said, too loudly, "Visiting hours are long over, sir. Does Ms. Hale know you're here?" Through the gap in the door, Severin saw his wife go rigid, saw her head turn, saw, in the half-second before he stepped back out of the light, the look on her face when she realized that the one man she had married specifically, so she would never have to fear, had followed her to the only thing in the world she could not afford to lose. He walked out into the rain. He sat in the car a long time before he could make himself start it. He had built his whole life on a single principle, that everyone wanted something, and once you knew the shape of the wanting, you owned the person. It had never once failed him. It had made him rich. It had made him alone. And he had just watched it fail completely, because the thing his wife wanted was not money or safety or a seat at his table. It was 40 more minutes in a buzzing brick building with a girl whose heart was quitting, and there was no leverage in the world that could be applied to a love like that. You could not buy it. You could not threaten it. You could only stand in a corridor and feel, for the first time in years, poor. He did not yet know the half of it, but he knew, with the cold certainty he usually reserved for knowing how a fight would end, that his mother had not given him a wife. She had given him a loaded gun and forgotten to tell him where it was pointed. She was waiting in his study when he got back to the estate, and she did not pretend. That was the first thing that disarmed him. That she didn't run, didn't construct, didn't reach for the smooth deflection she'd used on him twice before. She was sitting in the chair across from his desk with her coat still on and the small worn key in her open palm, looking at it, and when he came through the door she lifted her eyes and said simply, "You followed me, so now we do this the hard way. Sit down, Mr. Lazary, you're going to want to be sitting." He did not sit. He shut the door and leaned against it. "Who is the girl?" "My sister. Senna. She's 16. She has a heart that's been trying to quit since she was 9, and the surgery that fixes it costs more than 2 honest people will ever see in a lifetime." Imara's voice was flat, controlled, the voice of someone reading off a wound she had long since stopped being able to feel as separate from herself. "Our parents are dead. I've raised her since I was 19. So yes, I married you for money. You can stop wondering. Just not the way men like you assume." "That," Severin said, "is not the part you're afraid to tell me." Something that was almost a smile crossed Imara's face. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She set the key on the edge of his desk between them, the way you set down a thing you are giving up. 6 years ago, my father had a job he was proud of. Desmond Hale. He kept books. Real books. Clean ones. For a freight company that moved cargo through the North Harbor. He was honest in the specific stubborn way that gets honest men killed, and one spring he started noticing money in the freight accounts that didn't behave like money. Numbers that appeared on Sundays. Shipments that weighed more on paper than the trucks could carry. She watched his face. "The freight company was awash for your family's product, Mr. Lazary. My father didn't know that. He thought he'd found a thief. So he did what an honest man does. He started writing it down." The room had gone very cold, or Severin had. "Go on." "He took it to the wrong person, someone he trusted, someone who smiled and said, 'Leave it with me, Des. I'll handle it.'" Her jaw tightened. 3 weeks later, my father drove his car off the Halverson overpass at 2 in the morning, stone sober, with a note in his own handwriting that he never wrote. The police called it what they were paid to call it. We buried an honest man as a coward and a suicide, and the debt collectors came before the flowers were dead, And I took my little sister and what was left, and I disappeared into the East End, and I learned how to be afraid quietly. For 6 years. She was quiet for a moment, and when she went on, her voice had thinned to something almost without color. You learn things. In 6 years of being afraid. You learn to work 3 jobs and still hear a monitor beeping in your sleep. You learn which emergency rooms won't ask too many questions and which landlords will. You learn to make your face stop doing the thing faces do, so that no one ever sees you flinch. Because a woman alone who flinches is a woman someone decides to test. I got good at it. I got so good that the man who killed my father could take my hand at my own wedding, and I almost held. She looked at the key. Almost. She drew a breath. I never knew the name of the man who smiled at my father. I only knew it was someone in your family. I thought I'd die not knowing. And then, Severin said, and then your mother found me. Imara's composure cracked for the first time. Not into tears, but into something raw, the disbelief of a person describing the impossible. 4 months ago, a woman I'd never met walked into the diner where I worked the closing shift and ordered tea, and waited until everyone was gone and said, I knew your father. I've been looking for his daughters for a long time, and I am dying, and I have something I need to give you before I do. She touched the key. It's a safe deposit box. Your mother kept the family's true books for 20 years, Severin. Every clean lie, every dirty truth. She knew what happened to my father. She didn't order it, and she didn't stop it. And she carried that for 6 years until the cancer made carrying things pointless. Imara's voice dropped. She gave me the proof, the transfers, the forged notes, real author. The whole rotten architecture of how a man gets murdered for finding a discrepancy. And she asked me for 2 things in exchange. The clock on the mantel ticked. Severin did not move. She asked me to forgive her, which I did, because she was a dying woman who'd spent her last strength trying to make one thing right, and I am not so hard yet that I could refuse her that. Imara looked up at him, and now her eyes were wet and absolutely steady. And she asked me to marry you, to get inside the house, because the same man who killed my father is moving against you, right now, the same patient way he moved against Desmond Hale. And your mother knew you would never let a stranger close enough to warn you, but you would never turn away a wife she begged you to take. A pause. She didn't give you a bride to comfort herself, Severin. She gave you a bodyguard you'd never suspect. She bought your life with the only currency you wouldn't refuse, her last wish. Severin had been still for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone to the quiet register that emptied rooms. The name. You already know it. Imara held his gaze. You saw my hand at the wedding. I've spent 6 years building a face that doesn't react to anything, and your cousin took my hand and I couldn't hold it, because I'd seen him once before, 6 years ago, leaving my father's office the week before the overpass. Smiling. Leave it with me, Des. Renato. The name came out of Severin like something pulled from deep water. Renato pulled the trigger your father never knew was aimed at him. Imara's hand closed over the key. But he didn't sign the order alone. The box proves he had help. Money that came from above him. A signature your mother blacked out because even dying she couldn't bring herself to write it where I'd see. There's someone over Renato. Someone she was more afraid of than the cancer. Her voice was barely a breath now. I don't know who, but they're already inside your walls, and the wedding bought them their window. And if your mother was right about the timeline, they move on you before she's even in the ground. The study was silent except for the rain and the clock, and the small sound of Severin breathing. He thought of his cousin's hand on his shoulder. Aunt Octavia always did know best. He thought of his mother's smile across the chapel at a woman she had searched 4 months to find. He thought of a girl with a failing heart laughing in the dark, asking, "Is it almost over?" He thought of every transaction he had ever made, every contract he had ever called by a gentler name, and he understood that he was standing inside the only one that had ever been built out of love instead of leverage, and that he had nearly thrown it away on principle. He crossed the room. Imara rose to meet him, wary, braced, for anger, for dismissal, for the cold dissolution she'd been promised the day they met. He did not give her any of those. "You were going to do this alone," Severin said. It was not a question. "Finish it. Walk into a war against my own blood, with a sick sister and a key and 6 years of being afraid quietly. By yourself." "It's what I do," Imara said. "Not anymore." He reached out, slowly, the way you reach for something that has every right to flinch, and closed his hand over hers, over the key, his fingers warm against her cold ones. "I told you the day we met I'd dissolve this when she was gone. I'm telling you now that I lied without knowing I was lying." His thumb moved once across her knuckles. "My mother didn't buy me a bodyguard, Imara. She gave me the one person in this family who came here for the right reasons. The only one I can trust precisely because you have every reason to hate me." "I don't hate you," Imara said, and looked surprised to hear herself say it. "Then we have a problem," Severin said softly, "because I was counting on at least one of us staying sensible." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, the first real one she'd ever given him, and for a moment the cold sitting-room mask was gone from both of them at once. He looked at her for a long moment after the laugh faded, and when he spoke again it was lower, and it cost him something he didn't usually spend. "My mother spent my whole life trying to give me a reason to be a person instead of a position. She failed every time because every gift she offered I turned into an asset, a connection, leverage. She knew I'd do the same to a bride. Sign the paper, file the wife, dissolve it clean." He shook his head slowly. "So she didn't give me a wife. She gave me someone I'd have to fight beside or die without. She knew the only way to make me feel something was to put my life in the hands of a person I couldn't buy, couldn't frighten, and couldn't replace. She spent her last act of strength outmaneuvering her own son." His mouth curved, not quite a smile. "I knew exactly what I was doing. That's what she told me, the day she asked. I thought she was confused. She was the only clear-headed person in this house." Then his face hardened into the thing the city was afraid of. "Your father wrote it down because he thought writing it down was enough," he said. "It wasn't. Honest men keep records. I keep promises." He lifted her hand, key and all, the gold ring catching the lamplight. "Renato signed your father's death warrant. Someone above him signed it too. So here's the new arrangement, wife. The real one. We don't dissolve. We don't run. We open that box, we find the name your mother couldn't write, and we burn every last one of them down to the foundation." Imara stared at the man she had married to destroy, who was offering instead to hand her the match. "Together," she said, testing the word. "Together," Severin said, "starting tonight." Outside, somewhere beyond the rain-streaked glass, a car that did not belong to anyone Severin employed turned slowly off the main road and cut its headlights at the foot of the long Lazari Drive. Neither of them saw it yet. The car at the foot of the drive was gone by the time Anselm reached it, but it had left a gift. A cigarette crushed out against the gatepost, still faintly warm, and a patch of flattened grass where a man had stood for a while watching the house. Anselm brought the cigarette to Severin in the study, holding it in a handkerchief like evidence, which it was. "Someone's counting our lights," Severin said. He turned the stub over once and set it down. "Counting how many of us there are. When we sleep. Who comes and goes." He looked at Imara, who had not gone to bed, who stood by the cold hearth with her coat still on and the key still in her fist. "Your father's killer is patient. You told me that yourself. He won't kick in a door. He'll wait until the math is in his favor and then he'll make it look like grief. So they learned to live carefully, which neither of them found difficult, because careful was the native tongue of them both. What surprised Severin was how quickly careful turned into something else. They could not move openly. Renata was blood, and blood meant the capos would want a reason before they'd turn on him, and the reason, the box, the proof, sat in a safe deposit vault across the city that they did not dare visit while a stranger counted their lights. To go for it now was to show the enemy exactly where the knife was kept. So they waited, and they planned, and they did it together, at the long table in the study, two careful people building a careful war by lamplight. He learned things about her, that she took her tea with an absurd amount of sugar, a habit left over from a childhood where sweetness was the cheapest comfort going, and that she was embarrassed by it, and that the embarrassment was the most human thing he had yet seen her do. He started having it ready for her without comment. The first night he set the cup down at her elbow, already sweetened, she went very still and looked at it for a long moment. And then she didn't thank him, because thanking him would have made it a transaction, and they had both spent their whole lives in transactions and were tired. She learned things about him too, that under the stillness was a mind that never stopped, that he mapped every room he entered, that the cold was not cruelty, but a door he'd welded shut so young he'd forgotten there was a room behind it. She watched him with his mother, the 6 o'clock visits, the sanitized reports to a woman too weak to hear them, the way his voice changed in that room and changed back the instant he left it. And she began, against every instinct she had spent 6 years sharpening, to ache for him. He did one thing in those first days that he did not tell her about. He had Senna moved. Quietly, through a doctor who owed him a discretion he had never before had a kind use for, the girl with the failing heart was transferred from buzzing St. Bernadette to a private cardiac unit where the monitors were newer and the surgeons did not flinch at the size of the bill. He told the doctor to bill it to a shell company 3 names deep, so that Imara would not find a thread leading back to his accounts, because he understood. He had spent the night in the corridor understanding that her pride was the only armor she had left, and that taking it from her would be its own kind of theft. She found out anyway. She found out because she found out everything. And she came to him white-faced and furious, not because he had paid, but because he had hidden it, and they had their first real fight, low-voiced, controlled, 2 people who didn't know how to raise their voices circling each other in a study at 2 a.m. "You don't get to do that," she said. "You don't get to reach into my life and fix the one thing and hide it so I can keep pretending I'm handling it. That's not a kindness. That's a leash with a bow on it." It wasn't a leash. His voice stayed level, which somehow made it worse. "It was the only thing I had that was worth anything. You spend yourself on that girl until there's nothing left, and I have more money than 3 lifetimes can launder, and watching you ration tea and count buses while a surgeon waits on a wire transfer is—" He stopped. He was not a man who stopped. "It's obscene, Imara. It offends me. Let me spend it on something that isn't a bribe or a coffin." She had no answer for that, and the not having an answer was its own kind of falling. Somewhere in the middle of the fight it stopped being about money and started being about the fact that 2 people who had each decided long ago to need no one were standing very close together in the dark and finding it harder and harder to remember why. It was Cosimo who interrupted them. The consigliere arrived the next morning unannounced, as he had earned the right to over 40 years. A small, neat, silver-haired man with a tailor's eye and a priest's patience, who had buried Severin's father and taught Severin his letters and was, by every account Severin had ever trusted, the last truly loyal man in a world that had run out of them. He kissed Imara's hand. He called her Signora and said the family was blessed, said the capos were uneasy with a new wife and an old woman dying and the succession unsettled. Said only that Severin should let his oldest friend smooth the waters, as he always had. He was warm. He was kind. He was exactly what he had always been. And Imara, pouring his coffee, caught the way Cosimo's eyes moved once, just once, to the front of her coat, to the place where, under the fabric, the small worn key hung on a chain against her sternum. A flick of the eyes, there and gone, the look of a man checking whether a door he thought he'd locked was still locked. She said nothing. She smiled and poured. But that night she went back to the box's photographed pages, the transfers, the aliases, the blacked-out signature that sat above Renato like a held breath, and she stopped on eroding detail she had skimmed a dozen times. An account, an old one, dormant for years, and a single notation in Ottavia's careful hand, 3 words that turned Imara's blood to meltwater. He taught Sev. She sat in the dark a long time, the key cold against her chest, not telling her husband what she was beginning to be certain of, because she had seen his face in his mother's room. And she did not yet know how to tell a man who had welded one door shut that the friend who taught him his letters had signed her father's death. The call came at 4 a.m., and it was the call Imara had been bracing for since she was 19. Senna's heart had gone into a rhythm it could not hold. The private unit's nightline was calm in the way that means come now, and do not speed, and we both know you will speed. Imara was dressed and at the door before she had finished hearing it, and Severin was dressed and at the door beside her before she had finished being surprised that he was there at all. You don't have to, she said. I know, he said, and took the keys from her shaking hand, because a woman whose hands shake should not drive to a hospital at 4 a.m, and drove her himself. He did not say it would be all right. That was the thing she would remember later. That he was the only person in 6 years who had not promised her a thing he couldn't deliver. He drove fast and silent through the wet dark, and when they reached the unit he did not perform comfort. He simply parked and walked her in, and then stood against the corridor wall with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the door, a man standing watch, while the surgeons did what they did behind it. An hour in, he disappeared without a word and came back with 2 paper cups from a machine that had no business serving anything drinkable, and hers had 4 packets of sugar already stirred into it, because he had watched her at the study table and he did not forget things. She took it without looking at him. The tea was terrible. She drank all of it. It was, she would think much later, the single kindest cup of anything anyone had handed her since she was 19 years old, precisely because he asked nothing for it and said nothing about it, and simply went back to his place against the wall to keep watching a door he couldn't open either. It was a long night. Somewhere in the middle of it, with the coffee gone cold and the corridor lights humming, Imara stopped pretending to be made of stone. I found the records first, she said. She was looking at the door, not at him. 6 years ago, my father's. I was clever. Everyone always said how clever. And I'd help him with the books for fun. And I'm the one who noticed the Sunday numbers. The shipments that weighed wrong. I brought it to him. I said, Daddy, look, someone's stealing, you have to tell someone. Her voice did not break. It did something worse. It stayed perfectly level. He told someone because I told him to, and then he drove off an overpass he never drove off. So you can keep your money, Severin, and you can keep this house, and you can keep all of it, but understand what you married. I'm the reason my father is dead. I've spent 6 years keeping his other daughter alive because she's the only part of him I didn't get killed. And tonight, her heart is the one quitting, and I am sitting in another corridor, useless again, while someone I love is dying on the other side of a door I can't open. Severin was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the corridor and sat down on the cold floor beside her, against the wall, shoulder to shoulder, which was not a thing men like him did. My father put me in a car once, he said, when I was 9, told me to wait, that he'd be 10 minutes. He was meeting a man who'd been skimming. I sat in that car and I heard what 10 minutes sounds like when it isn't 10 minutes. And when my father came back, he didn't say a word. Just drove us home and told my mother I'd fallen asleep. That was the night I learned the trick of it. You take the part of yourself that flinches, and you find the door it lives behind, and you close it. And you keep closing it every time it tries to open, until one day you can sit in a car and hear anything, and your face does nothing at all. He turned his hands over, looked at them. Everyone thinks I'm cold because I'm cruel. I'm cold because I was a soft child in a hard house, and softness was a thing that got you hurt. So I stopped. I got very, very good at stopping. And it worked, Imara said. It worked perfectly. That's the worst part. It worked so well that by the time my mother was dying, I couldn't find the door anymore to feel it. I sat with her every evening at 6 and reported the weather of my business, and I could not make myself grieve a woman I would have died for, because the part that grieves had been behind that door so long I'd lost the key. He looked at her sidelong. You want to know what she said? The last clear conversation we had before the morphine took the words? She said, Severin, the things we do to protect the people we love are the things that damn us, and we do them all again. His voice didn't change, but something under it did. You didn't kill your father. You loved him out loud, at 19, the way you were supposed to be able to. The man who killed him took something honest and made it a weapon. That's not your sin. That's his. The only thing you're guilty of is being a clever girl who trusted that the truth was safe. You were wrong about the world. You weren't wrong to be. She turned and looked at him then, fully, for the first time without the welded door behind her eyes, and the look went on a beat too long, and the corridor was very quiet, and he became aware of the cold of her hand resting on the floor an inch from his. He covered it with his, warm, over cold, the way it had been in the study. She did not pull away. I had a plan, she whispered. I should tell you. When this was finished, when I'd found the name and burned them all down like I promised her, I was going to take Senna and disappear. New names. A coast somewhere. I never planned to stay in this house a single day past the work. I built the exit before I built the marriage. Her fingers turned, slowly, until they were laced through his. I'm telling you because the plan is still there. The names are bought. The coast is picked. And every day I spend in this house, I can feel myself wanting to tear it up. And that terrifies me more than your cousin ever could. Because the last time I let myself want something, I had to bury it off an overpass. You think wanting things is what got him killed? Severin said quietly. I know it is. No. He turned his hand under hers so their palms were together, the cold and the warm. Finding the truth got him killed. Wanting things is the only reason either of us is still sitting on this filthy floor instead of behind our doors where it's safe. You want your sister alive. I wanted, for the first time in my life, to be in a room I couldn't control. That's not the thing that damns us, Imara. That's the only thing that was ever going to save us. The surgeon came through the door at 6. Senna had held. The rhythm had broken and reset, and the small, failing heart was beating for now, and there would be a surgery, soon. A real one, the one the new account could pay for. Imara stood to go to her sister, and at the door she stopped and looked back at the man still sitting on the floor of a hospital corridor in a $5,000 coat. Don't make me want to stay, Severin, she said. It was not a threat. It was the closest thing to a plea she had left in her. He didn't answer, but he didn't promise to stop either, and they both heard that too. Ottavia Lazari died on a Tuesday at dawn, with white orchids on the table and her son's hand in hers, and her daughter-in-law reading to her in a low voice, the way she had every afternoon for weeks. She went the way she had lived at the end, without fuss, without fear, having arranged everything in advance. The doctors had given her 3 weeks. She had taken nearly 6, the way she had taken everything in her life. on her own schedule, and not a moment before she was ready. Her last clear word, 2 days before, had been finally. And neither of them had known whether she meant the dying or the marriage, and both of them suspected she'd meant it to be ambiguous, because she had always enjoyed having the last unreadable word. Severin did not weep. Imara watched him not weep, and understood it for what it was. A door welded shut so long ago that the man had genuinely lost the key, and was now standing at the threshold of a grief he had no way into. She took his hand, warm over cold, except this time hers was the warm one. He let her. He sat at the bedside for an hour after the body had gone still, not speaking, not moving, while the orchids did the only thing orchids do, which is outlast the room. When he finally rose, he straightened the blanket over a woman who no longer needed it, a small, useless tenderness that undid Imara more than tears would have. She'd want the orchids changed, he said, in a voice scraped down to nothing. She said the dying should be allowed one luxury that asks nothing back. Then he walked out and gave the orders a don gives when a matriarch dies, and his face did nothing at all, and Imara understood that she was watching a man grieve in the only language his father had ever taught him. Arrangements, executed correctly, on schedule. They had 2 days before the funeral. That was the window, and both of them knew it. The proof came together fully on the first of those 2 days. With Otavia gone, the dormant account had a death certificate to react to, and react it did. A flurry of small movements, a tidying, a man covering a track he'd left open for years because the only person alive who understood the books was a dying woman he'd assumed would take her knowledge into the ground. Imara followed the movements the way her father had once followed Sunday numbers. The same patient, stubborn arithmetic that had gotten Desmond Hale killed in the hands of the daughter he'd taught it to. And they led, all of them, every thread, to the same neat silver-haired hand. She worked through the night with the lamp low and the key cold against her sternum, and by morning she had what her father had died trying to build, not a suspicion, but a case. She laid it out on the long table for Severin without softening it, because he had asked her never to soften anything again. It's Cosimo. She set the photographed pages down one by one, a tribunal of paper. He's been bleeding the family for 30 years, skimming the legitimate freight, washing it through accounts your father never audited because your father trusted him the way you trust him. My father found a piece of it. A small piece. He didn't even know it was Cosimo. He just knew it was theft. And he took it to the man he reported to, and that man took it to his friend Cosimo. And Cosimo smiled and said, "Leave it with me," and 3 weeks later, the overpass. Her hands were steady now. The shaking was done. Renato was the trigger. He's always been the trigger. He likes it. It's the only thing the family ever let him be good at. But Cosimo is the hand. He ordered my father killed to protect a theft. And now your mother is dead and the books are unguarded and you're a new Don with a stranger wife the capos don't trust. And he is going to do to you exactly what he did to my father. He'll make it grief. An accident. A heartbroken man. Careless after his mother's death. She looked up. He's going to do it at the funeral, Severin. When the whole family's gathered and your guard is down and no one's counting the lights because they're all crying. That's the window. That's why he's been so patient. He's been waiting for her to die. Severin stood at the window a long while, his back to her, looking out at the grounds where men were already setting chairs for a funeral. Cosimo carried me on his shoulders, he said quietly. He paid for my schooling out of his own pocket the year my father was inside. When my father died, he sat with me 3 nights and didn't say a word. Just sat, so I wouldn't be alone in the house. There is no one alive I have trusted longer. I know, Imara said. I'm sorry. I know what it is to find out the man who smiled at you signed the warrant. He did not answer at first. She watched him stand at the glass and do the arithmetic she could not see, 40 years of letters and shoulders, and 3 silent nights after his father died, weighed against a dead woman's careful pages and a bookkeeper off an overpass. She did not push. She had handed a man the same kind of truth her father had once handed the wrong person, and she knew exactly how heavy it was to set down. He turned, and the thing in his face was not the cold mask, and it was not grief. It was a decision, arriving. "The capos won't follow me if I move against him on a stranger's word," he said. "You understand that. I kill my father's consigliere 2 days after my mother dies, on the say-so of a wife nobody knows, and half the family bolts, and the other half puts a price on both our heads. The smart play, the play Cosimo himself taught me, is to do nothing. Bury my mother. Keep the peace. Let the new dawn look stable. Deal with him later, quietly, from a position of strength." He came to the table. "That's the old code. Protect the family's face above the family's truth. My father lived by it. My grandfather built this house on it. And," Imara said, barely breathing, "and my mother spent her last act on earth putting an honest man's daughter in my house so that I would finally have a reason to break it." He put his hand flat on the photographed pages, on Desmond Hale's murder, laid out in a dead woman's careful hand. "Your father wrote it down because he believed the truth was worth more than his safety. He was right, and it killed him. I've spent my whole life believing the opposite, and it kept me breathing, and it made me a dead man who happened to be walking." His jaw set. Here is what the old code never understood. A family that buries its own rot to keep its face isn't strong. It's already dead. It just hasn't been told. Cosimo has been counting on that for 30 years, on the certainty that we'd rather protect a lie than survive a truth. He built his whole life on us being cowards in good suits. He looked up at her. "I'm done being a credit to his arithmetic." "They could turn on you," Imara said. "All of them. You know that." "Then I'll find out today what I'm actually standing on, instead of dying later assuming it was solid." He almost smiled. "Your father pulled a thread alone in the dark, and it cost him everything. We're going to pull it in the daylight, in front of every witness in the family, where the one thing Cosimo has never once survived is the truth being said out loud. We're not waiting for the smart moment, Imara. We're going to bury my mother. And at her funeral, in front of every capo in the family, I am going to put the truth on the table where Cosimo can't smile it away. And we are going to find out, in front of everyone, whether the Lazzari name still means anything honest at all." Outside, the chairs went on being set, row by row, for a gathering that 2 men intended to be a trap, and 1 man and 1 woman now intended to be a reckoning. The funeral was at noon the next day. They buried Ottavia Lazzari from the family chapel, the same narrow stone room where her son had married a stranger 5 weeks before, and the irony was not lost on either of the 2 people who knew the whole shape of the thing. The capos came in black. 40 years of the family's power filled the small room and spilled into the antechamber and out onto the lawn. Hard men and their hard sons, the heads of 6 crews, the money and the muscle of everything the Lazzari name had ever been. Cosimo gave the eulogy. He spoke beautifully, as he did everything, about loyalty and blood and the long patience of family, and he wept real tears, because the most dangerous liars believe the half of the lie that flatters them. Renato stood at his shoulder, restless, his hand never far from his coat, his eyes doing the Count Severin's man had once been caught doing at the gate. Severin sat in the front row with his wife's cold hand in his warm one and waited. He had spent the night placing his pieces. Anselm and 6 men he would trust with the last breath in his body, scattered through the mourners in borrowed grief, each one briefed on a single face and a single rule. Nobody moves until Renato's hand leaves his coat, and then everybody moves at once. The photographed pages were inside Severin's own jacket, over his heart, where a weaker man might have kept a photograph. He had not slept. He had sat instead in his mother's empty room with the orchids and rehearsed the hardest sentence he would ever say, naming his oldest friend as the man who had ordered an honest man's death, until it stopped shaking in his mouth. He waited through the eulogy. He waited through the prayers. He waited until the moment Cosimo had surely chosen for himself, the lowering, when the family would press close around the grave on the eastern lawn, heads bowed, backs turned, a heartbroken Don at the lip of the hole with his guard down, and his men distracted by grief. That was the window. That was always going to be the window. So at the graveside, before the first handful of earth, Severin Lazari stood and turned his back on his mother's coffin to face the family and said, in the quiet voice that emptied rooms, "Before we put her down, you should all know what she spent her last breath trying to tell me." The lawn went still. He did not shout. He laid it out the way Amara had laid it out for him, paper by paper, plain and cold and impossible to smile away. The skim, the washed accounts. 30 years of a trusted hand in the family's pocket. And then the name Desmond Hale, an honest bookkeeper who found a thread and pulled it, and was driven off the Halverson overpass with a suicide note in another man's forgery, on the order of the man who had just wept so beautifully over Atavia's coffin. Her name was on these books too, Severin said, holding up the dead woman's careful pages. She kept the truth for 20 years because she was afraid of him. Him, not a rival, not the law, the man you let stand up here today and tell you about loyalty. He turned at last to Cosimo. "You taught me my letters, old man. You should have taught me worse ones." For one breath Cosimo's face held its sorrow. Then it didn't, and what was underneath was so calm, so unsurprised, so patient, that it was its own confession. "Renato," Cosimo said pleasantly, not raising his voice either, because he had taught Severin that too. "Now." It happened fast, the way these things do. Not the choreographed thunder of the movies, but a few ugly seconds of motion in a crowd of black coats. Renato's hand came out of his coat. 2 of Cosimo's men, planted among the capos, reached for theirs. But Severin had not spent 2 days mourning. He had spent them placing Anselm and 6 loyal men among the mourners, and the instant Renato moved, the lawn became a brief, brutal contest of who had counted whom. Renato never got his shot at Severin. Anselm took him off his feet before he could level the weapon, and the 2 planted men were on the ground and disarmed before they cleared their coats. And for a few wild seconds the eastern lawn was all shouting and scattering black coats, and Severin was reaching for the weapon at his own back. And Cosimo, who had always understood that the real leverage is never the gun, but the thing the other man loves, had stepped in close behind Imara, a small flat pistol in his hand. The lawn froze. "You were always sentimental under all that ice," Cosimo said to Severin, almost gently, backing toward the chapel with Imara held against him, the gun steady. "Your mother's worst gift to you. She thought she was arming you. She was just giving me a softer place to push." His arm tightened. Imara did not struggle. Imara had gone absolutely, perfectly still. The stillness Severin had seen the day they met, the stillness of a woman taking the measure of a thing and finding it ordinary. "Put it down, Severin. Tell your dog to let Renato up. We walk out of here and renegotiate the terms of your very short reign, or I take the one thing your mother left you that you actually wanted. Your choice. You have always been so good at choices." And Severin Lazari, who had a clear shot, and a dead woman in the ground and 40 witnesses, lowered his weapon and set it on the grass, because Cosimo was right about exactly one thing, and it was the only thing that mattered anymore. But Imara had not married a man so she would never have to fight. She had married him so her sister would be safe, and that work was done. Senna was 3 miles away with a mended heart and a future, And the only thing left in the world that Amara Hale was still afraid of losing was, absurdly, impossibly, the cold man now kneeling in the grass for her. 6 years of being afraid quietly had taught her to give nothing away, and she gave nothing away now. She did not beg. She did not tremble. She let her shoulders drop, the half-inch a frightened woman's shoulders drop. Let Cosimo feel her go soft and beaten against him. Let the old man believe, for 1 second, the only second she would need, that he had read her the way he'd read everyone for 40 years. Her hand, where Cosimo couldn't see it, closed around the chain at her throat. The key, small, old, worn smooth. Iron, her father's evidence, her mother-in-law's atonement, the weight that had hung over her heart for 4 months. And before that, in spirit, for 6 years. She brought the key down hard across the back of his hand, the hand with the gun, with 6 years of quiet, swallowed, perfectly stilled rage behind it. His grip broke, the pistol dropped into the wet grass, and Severin came up off the ground already moving, crossing the space between them faster than a man his size had any right to, and it was over before the old man finished staggering back. Anselm had the fallen gun, 2 of the loyal men had Cosimo's arms, and Imara stood in the wet grass with her father's key closed tight in her fist, breathing hard, the welded-shut woman and the warm one at once. Finally, after 6 years, no longer afraid. When the lawn was quiet again, Cosimo was on his knees in the grass at the foot of Ottavia's open grave, disarmed, cradling his hand, surrounded by the men he'd thought were his, the truth laid out on paper for every capo to read. He looked up at Severin with the patient eyes that had ordered an honest man's death and watched a boy learn his letters, and he found at last that he had run entirely out of things that would smile their way free. "She was the most dangerous gift my mother ever gave me," Severin said, standing over him, Imara's hand finding his. "You taught me that the real leverage is the thing a man loves. You were right. You just never understood that it cuts both ways." He let the family take Cosimo away. Whatever came next would not happen at the graveside, because he would not give his mother that. But everyone on the eastern lawn understood, watching the new Don and his wife walk back toward the house with the Consigliere's empire in ruins on the grass behind them, that the question Severin had asked, whether the Lazari name still meant anything honest, had just been answered, in front of all of them, by a woman none of them had bothered to know. It took 3 weeks to learn the full shape of what Cosimo had built, and another month to take it apart. The first thing they did, once the watcher was gone and there was no one left to count the lights, was drive across the city to the vault they had never dared visit. The little iron key had gone through a consigliere's wrist the day before. Now it did the quiet job it had been cut for, and the safe deposit drawer slid open on what Ottavia had spent 20 years hiding and her last strength handing on: the originals. Her true books, every clean lie and dirty truth in her own careful hand. The proof Imara had until then only ever held as photographs. The photographs had been enough to stop a killing at a graveside. The originals were the kind of proof that ended dynasties. Severin did it the way his mother would have, through the books. He did not have to kill his way through the family. The paper did the work that bullets would have started a war over. Crew by crew, the capos saw the 30 years laid bare, every dollar Cosimo had bled from men who'd thought him a brother. And one by one they came to the new dawn, not out of fear, but out of the older, rarer thing fear had always stood in for: respect. It was, the older capos agreed quietly among themselves, the strangest accession any of them had witnessed. A Don who'd exposed the family's rot at his own mother's grave instead of burying it for the sake of appearances. A Don whose first act of real power had been to clear a stranger's name rather than blacken an enemy's. And a wife. A black woman from the East End nobody had bothered to learn the history of, who had read the family's accounts better than the man who had spent 30 years cooking them, and who had put a key through his wrist when 40 armed men stood frozen. They had expected to test the new arrangement. Instead, they found, somewhat to their own discomfort, that they believed in it. Renato, who had only ever been a trigger, was given to the family to judge, and the family, having read what he'd done to a bookkeeper and his daughters, was not gentle. Cosimo himself simply stopped being, in the quiet, complete way that men in that world stopped being. And the silver-haired architect who had outlived 2 dawns died, having badly underestimated the third and the third's wife. Desmond Hale's name was the part Severin would not delegate. He had the original suicide note pulled from a 6-year-old case file by a detective who suddenly remembered owing the family a favor, and he had it examined by people who proved, on paper, in language a court would accept, that an honest man had not driven himself off the Halverson overpass in shame. The record was corrected. It was a small thing, a line changed in a database, a cause of death amended from suicide to homicide, perpetrator deceased. And it was the largest thing Severin had ever given anyone, and he gave it to a dead man he had never met. Because the dead man's daughter had given him back a life he hadn't known was missing. He did one more thing she didn't ask for. He had a new stone set at Desmond Hale's grave, plain and good, and beneath the name and the dates he had them cut 3 words that were not sentiment but verdict. He was right. He took Imara there himself, on a gray afternoon, and stood back while she knelt in front of a corrected truth 6 years too late, and said something to her father that Severin did not try to hear, because some arrangements a man executes, and then has the grace to step away from. Senna's surgery was on a Thursday. It lasted 9 hours. Severin sat in the waiting room the entire time, in a different $5,000 coat, next to a wife who no longer pretended she could do the waiting alone. Somewhere in the 7th hour she fell asleep against his shoulder mid-sentence, and he sat without moving for 90 minutes so as not to wake her, a man who had once sat motionless in a car at 9 to learn how not to feel, sitting motionless now for the opposite reason entirely. The small heart that had been quitting since the girl was 9 was repaired by surgeons who did not flinch at anything, and when Senna woke, groggy and furious about the catheter and asking for terrible hospital gelatin, Imara laughed the helpless head-tipped laugh Severin had watched through a door in the dark. Except this time she was holding his hand while she did it, and this time he was inside the room. "You're crying," Senna informed her sister with the merciless clarity of 16. "I'm not," Imara said, crying. She does that now," Severin said gravely, and Senna looked at the most feared man in the city making a joke at her sister's expense and decided, in the instant way of teenagers, that he was acceptable. The night they brought Senna home, to the estate, to a wing with newer monitors and a garden she could see from the bed, Imara found, on the desk in the study, a sealed envelope she had never seen before. Her name was on it, in a careful hand she had come to know from 20 years of photographed ledgers, Ottavia's hand. "She gave it to Anselm before she died," Severin said from the doorway. He had a cup of tea in his hand, sweetened, absurdly, the way only one person in the house took it. He set it at her elbow without comment. "Told him to give it to you when the work was finished and the house was quiet. He says she was very specific that I was not to read it first." A pause. "I didn't." Imara turned the envelope over in her hands. The work was finished. The house was quiet. Her sister was sleeping down the hall with a mended heart. Her father's name was clean. The men who had taken everything were gone. And the exit she had built, the new names, the picked coast, sat untouched in a drawer upstairs, going stale. Every day, a little less like a plan and a little more like a thing she was relieved she hadn't used. She did not open the letter that night. She held it, and she drank the oversweet tea a killer had learned to make exactly the way she liked it. And she let herself feel, for the first time since she was 19 years old, something she had spent 6 years refusing to risk. She walked the quiet house instead. Past the wing where Senna slept with a heart that no longer threatened to quit. Past the study where the true books now balanced honest. Past the chapel where she had married a stranger and buried his mother. Past the cold sitting room with the men's portraits where she had once promised a stranger he'd be rid of her the moment his mother was gone. The exit she had built, the names, the coast, the head start, sat in a drawer upstairs going stale. Every day a little less like a plan and a little more like a thing she was relieved she hadn't used, a door she kept forgetting to be tempted by. She let herself feel safe. She opened the letter on a Sunday morning in the garden, with the white orchids Otavia had insisted on living again in pots along the wall, because Imara had asked the gardener to keep them, and had not entirely let herself wonder why. It was short. Otavia had been dying when she wrote it. She had not wasted words. Imara, if you are reading this, then you finished it, and you are still in my house, and I was right, though I will not be there to be insufferable about it, which is the only part I regret. I want to tell you why orchids. When I married into this family at 19, terrified, given like a contract to a man I did not love, the old woman who came before me, my husband's mother, gone these 50 years, sent me a single white orchid with a note that said only, "They look fragile and they outlive everything in the room. Be an orchid. I have kept them in every house I have lived in since. I am giving them to you now. I did not put you in my son's path to protect him. That is what I let him believe, because a man like Severin will accept a duty before he will accept a gift. The truth is, I had 2 children dying, my son of a coldness I gave him, and a girl I had failed for 6 years. And I had 1 move left, and I spent it putting the 2 of you in the same house and praying you would each thaw the other before the cancer took my chance to watch. He will never say it first. He doesn't have the door for it, so you will have to be brave enough for both, the way you have always been brave enough for everyone. Be an orchid, Imara. You look fragile. You have outlived everything in the room. Thank you for forgiving an old woman. Thank you for staying. I knew exactly what I was doing." Imara was still sitting with the letter in her lap, the orchids white against the stone, when Severin came out into the garden and found her crying. Not the silent, swallowed, perfectly stilled crying of a woman who had spent 6 years not flinching, but the loud, ugly, human kind, the kind you can only do in front of someone you have decided, finally, to need. He did not perform comfort. He had learned that from her. He simply sat down on the cold garden bench beside her, shoulder to shoulder, and waited. And when she turned and pressed her wet face into his shoulder, he put his arms around her and held the bravest, least afraid person he had ever met, while she came entirely apart in the safety he had spent his whole armored life believing was a thing that happened to other men. She knew, Imara said into his collar, from the start. She wasn't matching a bodyguard to a Don. She was... "I know," Severin said. "She told me too, in her way." He pulled back just enough to look at her, and the welded door behind his eyes was simply gone, had been gone for some time, and he had only now noticed he wasn't cold. "I married you to bury a duty, Imara. I was going to dissolve it the week she died. I had the paperwork drawn." His thumb moved across her cheek, warm against the salt. "Do you know the exact moment it stopped being paperwork? It wasn't the hospital. It wasn't the grave. It was the cold sitting room, the first day, when you looked at the most dangerous man in the city like he was weather, and told me you wanted nothing from me, and I'd never have to see you again." He almost smiled. "Everyone has always been afraid of me. You were the first person who looked at me and was only tired, unimpressed, free. I have spent 34 years making people afraid because I thought it was the only thing I had to offer. And you wouldn't take it. you wouldn't be afraid of me, and so you made me find out what else was in the room. There's an exit upstairs, Imara said unsteadily. New names, a coast. I built it before I built us. I know that too. I'm going to burn it. I know. He pressed his forehead to hers, the way she had once bent her head to a dying woman's in a chapel, close and private, and a heartbeat too long. Stay, Imara. Not because I bought it or arranged it or won it. Stay because a woman I never expected and never deserved walked into my cold house to tear it down and accidentally built the only warm thing in it instead. Stay because my mother was right, which she would want noted. His voice dropped. Stay because I love you, which I did not expect, and cannot dissolve, and would not if I could. The cold man had finally said it first. For a moment, Imara couldn't answer at all, because she had spent 6 years making sure no one would ever say those words to her in a way she'd be foolish enough to believe. And here they were, said plainly, in a garden full of orchids, by the last man on earth she'd planned to let close. The exit upstairs had a coast and a set of names and a head start. It had everything except a single reason she still wanted it. Imara Hale, who had come to this house a sacrifice, a weapon, a stranger given like a contract, who had carried a sister and a grief and a 6-year war alone, took the hand he offered, warm over cold, and laced her fingers through his. Okay, she said. The same word she'd given a dying woman, the biggest word she had. She did not become the queen of anything that morning, or the silent power behind a throne, or any of the cold shapes the old world had a name for. She became something the Lazari name had never once held in 5 hard generations, a reason. Under her hand, the family's true books were rebuilt clean. The freight ran honest where it could, and quiet where it couldn't. And an honest bookkeeper's daughter sat at the head of a table her father had been murdered 3 streets from. Not to avenge him anymore. That was finished. But to make the thing that killed him into something he might, on a generous day, have been able to respect. Senna grew strong in the wing with the garden she could see from the bed, and learned the run of the great cold house, and warmed it the way only a 16-year-old with a borrowed second chance can. Signing jokes at the capos until the hardest of them learned to sign back, leaving the radio too loud, filling rooms that had been silent for 5 generations with the particular noise of a child who has decided, at last, that she is allowed to be one. Severin, who had built an empire inside the silence of rooms before and after he entered them, came home one evening to a house that was loud and stood in the doorway, and did not recognize the feeling in his chest for a long moment because he had no filing drawer for it and had stopped expecting to need one. And every morning, on the desk where he had once drawn up the paperwork to erase her, there was a cup of tea with too much sugar in it, waiting, made exactly right, by a man who had finally found the door. And beside it, more mornings than not, a woman who had stopped building exits, drinking it, unafraid. Severin Lazari married a stranger to bury his mother's last wish, and instead he buried the man he used to be. The cold one, the careful one, the one who called love a liability and slept behind a door he'd welded shut at 9. It took a woman with every reason to hate him, a key worn smooth by grief, and a mother who saw all of it coming. If this story got its hooks in you, do the thing that lets us make more. Tap like, subscribe, so the next one finds you. And tell me in the comments the exact moment you knew Severin was finished pretending. I read every one. See you in the next story.